And a very warm welcome. You're joining us here at Hyde Park on Derana 24. And tonight we'll be talking about the world economy, Sri Lanka, and how Sri Lanka's path to recovery from crisis will be shaped forward with the ongoing incidents in the world and challenges, as well as how Sri Lanka remains resilient to these ongoing challenges. I've invited to our studios a prominent scholar who is of Sri Lankan origin, who is based in the United States, Professor Asoka Bandarage. A very warm welcome to you.
Thank you very much.
There is a long list of accomplishments I have here, as our team has dug this up. But I like to highlight, you've written this book, Crisis in Sri Lanka and the World. You've authored the book and it's published now. I think this was sometime last year. Beyond that, this year we see that, especially with US President Donald Trump and his approach to trade wars, we see a number of challenges that our part of the world will face because of what's happening there. What is your analysis of Sri Lanka's situation today and how these world, not just the wars, but also challenges and impact and constraints to supply chains to demand is going to impact us here in Sri Lanka?
Yeah, there's so much going on in the world and it's difficult to keep a focus, but I think there's a necessity to keep a focus on the economy. Because as we see, Sri Lanka's economy is collapsing, and although goods are available, there's still a shortage of essentials and high inflation. Lots of people are leaving the country, an exodus of young professionals. So in a sense, the crisis continues. Now, some are hoping that with the change of regime in the United States and the demise of the so-called liberal order, that there could be better prospects for the global south, including Sri Lanka. But that's hard to imagine because as far as the United States is concerned, whether it's the Democrats or the Republicans, they are interested in their own expansion, one could say imperialist expansion. And also there is a war for resources around the world with not only the United States, but China, India, and other countries scrambling to grab natural resources as well as strategic locations and so on. So the challenges continue for Sri Lanka, whether despite the change of the administration in the United States.
Are you saying that Sri Lanka will be able to navigate these challenges in spite of these ongoing challenges?
Yeah, I think it requires the leadership of the country as well as the population to really look at what's going on, to be more educated and informed, and to move from a sense of powerlessness to taking their power. This new administration was brought to power with a massive mandate, and so it has the backing of the majority of the population, and how to really exercise that mandate is a challenge, which means, for example, renegotiating the IMF deal, which is not to Sri Lanka's advantage when you look at the fact.
You're saying it's not
to Sri Lanka's, yes,
of Sri Lanka,
because it was seen as the only alternative to the economic crisis.
But do you think Sri Lanka had any choice in drawing an agreement in favor of Sri Lanka, given the severity of the crisis we had faced at the time?
Yeah, I get into some of the details of this in my book. There is evidence that bilateral loans were available at that point, and that Sri Lanka didn't necessarily have to declare default. But having done this, now we have to move forward, which means sort of looking at various ways to make the IMF deal more palatable to the population.
You said there was evidence of certain bilateral loans that were available. If you could maybe explain that to us.
Yeah.
What was available at the time?
There was a Chinese bilateral loan that was available for, I believe, 2.9 billion. Mm-hmm. And instead of taking that, there was pressure for Sri Lanka to move towards the IMF deal. And because it's difficult to extricate the political and the economic, because we have to also understand the Sri Lankan issues in the context of the superpower rivalry and the Cold War, and the attempt to move Sri Lanka away from the sphere of Chinese influence into the IMF fold and bring more directly under Western control. Mm-hmm. So there was a lot going on at that time in terms of external influences in terms of making economic decisions. But now that that's happened, and the 2.9 billion IMF loan is considered the only alternative, but you have to look at its terms, and that's not really discussed much. It's sort of accepted as a given. There's no alternative to the IMF deal. Mm-hmm. But how could the debt service payments that are being made out of Sri Lanka's government revenue, which is extremely high, be brought down? Because that's something that needs to be negotiated. Mm-hmm. For example, over the next 10 years, it is shown that almost 26% of government revenue will go to servicing the external debt, which is very high.
By 2028, when we start repaying our loans and interests, are you saying with all that government revenue going in for servicing debt and interests accumulated over, do you think we are still not ready with a plan to recover these revenues that we will lose and to replace the revenues?
Yes, for example, some things are not being considered very seriously. For example, an amendment to the 2017 Foreign Control Exchange Act, which deregulated financial outflows. So organizations like Global Financial Integrity have shown that there's a lot of misinvoicing plunder, as they put it, that a lot of exports revenue in foreign exchange is hoarded in banks abroad, and this includes Sri Lanka's situation. And if that money, it is claimed that there's some $53 billion outside the country. If some of that, at least some of it can be brought back, it could definitely help repay the debt and get Sri Lanka on a stronger economic footing.
How can we draw a comparison or learn from countries that have acquired monies that were due to the country but have been hidden from?
Yeah, and I think that the whole global financial architecture needs to be questioned. Mm-hmm. And in terms of restructuring loans, there's got to be international mechanisms so that countries like Sri Lanka don't have to go on their own to make these negotiations. But if there's an international framework, that would be, more beneficial to especially the debt-ridden countries in the world. And there are some 54 to 70 countries that are debt-ridden, so Sri Lanka's situation is not unique. And another thing that needs to be taken into account in terms of economic recovery is not to go back to getting ISBs, international sovereign bonds, which the IMF deal projects that starting 2027, I believe, that Sri Lanka would go back to getting ISBs, international sovereign bonds. Mm-hmm. And those have very short maturation periods and very high interest rates. So it would be in order to have a moratorium on obtaining international sovereign bonds, which have caused so much havoc to the Sri Lankan economy because of much of it, the debt is owed to international sovereign bondholders.
Mm-hmm. Sri Lanka, when Sri Lanka declared default, and then soon last year, sometime in December, Sri Lanka exited the default status. But What do you suggest could have been done different at the time?
Yeah, that's a long story, isn't it? I think we have to look at not only changing the global financial architecture, which is really very exploitative vis-a-vis the poorer countries, the debt-ridden countries, but also the larger global economic system, especially the neoliberal order. And in my book, in this book, as well as my earlier books like Colonialism in Sri Lanka, I explore how the roots of the current crisis, the installation of an export-import economy, and the weakening of self-sufficiency and local production, which made the country dependent on imports for even the basic essentials, which meant that Sri Lanka, along with so many other dependent economies, became subservient to the vagaries of the international market. So when there were problems outside the country, the prices of exports going down, imports going up, the country is then in a foreign exchange crisis, unable to buy its own necessities, and it leads to shortages as well as other social problems. So there's a repetition of this cycle throughout, starting from the colonial period to 2022 and even to date. So I think that a questioning of the global economic system with its exploitative relations vis-a-vis the poorer countries, needs to be looked at. And this was something that Sri Lanka took leadership during the 60s and 70s in terms of calling for a new international economic order with better terms of trade for the poorer countries. And it's certainly time for a new international economic order which puts the planet and people before profit. And we also have to look at what kind of an economic order do we have in the world today, which is really controlled by a handful of billionaires and a small coterie of finance capital institutions like BlackRock, for example, the largest asset management company in the world. It's valued at $10 trillion. They are also, incidentally, the biggest ISB holder on Sri Lanka. So that's why there has to be more of an education and awakening on the part of people, not only in Sri Lanka but around the world, about the realities of the integrated globalized economy that we are living within.
You spoke about Sri Lanka's situation, and in the 60s how Sri Lanka called for a new order and also to counter the exploitative nature of certain economies on the poorer countries. But today, we've been talking about what brought Sri Lanka to where we are today. The crisis, how Sri Lanka plunged into such a deep crisis. At times people said it was beyond repair, but now Sri Lanka remains resilient, but still more needs to be done. We are at this period of moratorium where we await repayment of certain debt. But there are other scholars and academics and economists who come on our shows and say, if we don't do things right, we're going to fall into a deeper crisis. So I believe it's important we talk about where we went wrong and what we should not repeat.
Absolutely, and that's why sort of the global southern countries taking a more collective approach is also important, especially say the debt-ridden countries. There are groups like Debt Justice. There have been calls for debt cancellation. So even if it is not an outright debt cancellation, you can have debt renegotiation, and also using funds that are available to the country, like, for example, this foreign exchange that is lying abroad. How can that be brought back? And to also take a more activist position vis-a-vis the external powers who are controlling or beginning to control more of the natural resources and the strategic installations of the country. How to use that strategic position and the natural resources to the advantage of the country, and to balance these external interests.
Where did we go wrong? Didn't we know all this before?
Yeah, I think it is not just Sri Lanka. I think it is the world at large. It is it's really a human problem, you know, because this struggle for survival, environmental survival, social survival, is not particular to Sri Lanka, although I think it is felt more acutely here because of the recent crisis and the superpower struggle, the Cold War context within which Sri Lanka is facing this. But it is a global issue of ordinary people losing control over resources and external forces grabbing those resources and making decisions for them. So it's really a call for justice and distribution of resources, as well as planetary protection, because, you know, Sri Lanka is a country which is environmentally threatened with rise of coastal erosion, deforestation, you know, pollution, soil, water, air. So those should become the priorities over profit for a handful of billionaires outside the country, or even for an elite within the country.
While you specialize in international development, political economy, women, gender studies, multiculturalism, conflict analysis, resolution, peace, security, South Asia, population and ecology. You're very passionate about environment, I understand. We've been talking about climate change, the impact, how the country has to prepare going forward, and also the possibility of debt to nature swaps. How would you relate this to Sri Lanka's context? What's the possibility and potential for Sri Lanka really going forward as we look at massive amounts of debt that we will have to repay going forward?
Yeah, this is a very controversial question, as you may know, because on the face of it, it makes a lot of sense. You know, you have to pay the debt, and you have all these natural resources. Why don't you protect the forests in return for debt cancellation of some sort? But then there is the issue of also development and meeting the needs of people. It is not a completely anti-growth position. I mean, it's the poorer classes that have to increase their consumption, and the richer classes that have to bring down their consumption. So you cannot simply take away resources from people who need it. And also there is an element of putting the onus of environmental protection on the countries in the south and the poorer classes, because there is also pollution has become a commodity that you can buy the right to pollute, and have poorer countries safeguard their resources and nature, whereas some of the richer countries and corporations can pollute as they like because they have the money to pay to buy the right to pollute. So the commoditized mechanisms to address nature are not always the most viable ones.
Before we speak further, I'd like to go back to where the crisis was, what really brought us there, and what we should do to avoid such crisis. We spoke about this, but I'd like to really look back and see what brought us to where we were in 2021.
Yeah, I think like many other countries around the world, COVID-19, the Ukraine crisis, all of these, you know, came together in creating the supply chain problems, and a lot of countries, you know, fell into economic crises. Even in the United States, you know, there were shortages, and so that's what precipitated it. But it is the underlying structural factors, you know, that had laid the framework for these kinds of crises to emerge. When countries become dependent on imports for their basic survival and exports to gain the foreign exchange, but the moment that export production goes down or the revenue goes down, then the country is unable to buy its own necessities. So I think we have to look at the roots of that and then really question the whole model of globalization, which is not to say that all of globalization is bad and that we should have autarky and that, it's not completely going back to that, but it's a more of a balance between localized production and then global interdependence. And I think the food sovereignty issue is so critical with regard to that. And there are, in fact, many groups talking about bioregionalism, local agriculture. You don't really hear that much about it in mainstream media, but there are groups, talking about more balanced approaches to economic development and justice.
You spoke about food security. I think a couple of years after the crisis too, we've been talking about how there's a shortage of essentials at times. But this really translates into lack of strategy here in Sri Lanka. How can we move from, we've been talking about consistent policies, governments to continue with certain policy decisions that were taken by previous governments as well. But regardless of that, what do you suggest should be, or propose, should be Sri Lanka's direction in economic decision making, and especially when we talk whether it's manufacturing, whether we have to focus on exports really, or agriculture?
Yeah, I think it has to be a combination, with priority being given to local food self-sufficiency and local agriculture, because agriculture is, as you know, is really weakening, and a lot of people are leaving farming, and around the world, land is being taken away from small farmers and being sold off to transnational corporations and private interests for agribusiness. And they don't necessarily meet the local food requirements, because a lot of agribusinesses provide for export agriculture. So there's got to be a very careful approach to land commoditization, because 80% of the land in Sri Lanka is still held by the state. And there has been an attempt to privatize this land, give freehold rights to the farmers. Now, on the face of it, it looks like a very good thing, but if you look at the history, and I've followed this starting from the colonial period, there was an attempt to privatize land and make it a commodity, and that often led to the farmers, the smallholders, losing control over the land, and external groups taking control, and their focus is not so much food self-sufficiency. So I think with this land alienation and commoditization schemes, that one has to be very careful. And also the land, like the mineral resources, the maritime resources, are also being grabbed by external interests, not just in Sri Lanka but around the world, and there are also strategic and security interests behind that. So I think that to prioritize local needs of survival and creation of livelihoods, which is also why people are leaving the country. So where is the future if so many of the young, especially professionals, are leaving the country? That has to be stopped or managed rather than encouraged, because that becomes a part of the export of labor, part of the export model. I mean, lots of people have been working in the Middle East for decades, and that is the primary source of foreign exchange for Sri Lanka even now. But that has had its costs in terms of family, community, and
you spoke about external interests. This also brings us to foreign policy. But before that, do you think Sri Lanka is in a state of helplessness, really, when it comes to managing these external parties, especially major powers who have interests in the country, given our strategic and geopolitical location, and also our strategic areas of interest for these countries?
Yeah, sometimes it seems like Sri Lanka has become subservient to three masters, not just one, but it's a question of how is that turned around, and Sri Lanka gets the benefits of this strategic location as well as all the resources and everything that the country has to offer. So I think that the foreign policy is really key in terms of taking leadership in negotiation and balancing these different interests, and rather than become subservient.
When talking about the population and our situation here, there is a stark revelations about the rate of unemployment in the country, especially after the crisis. But this also is part of our remnants of the challenges we faced post-COVID, a prolonged period of shutdown, and we had the informal sector going out of business and the tourism sector affected, and this impact had ripple effects on the economy. But today tourism seems to be booming, or at least improving. But is this sustainable? Have we looked at sustainable or sustaining this kind of economic activity even after we faced not just two crises, it was a triple blow on the economy?
Yes, tourism is booming, but it's a very fickle industry, as you well know, because the moment there is a natural disaster or a political disaster, tourist arrivals go down. And so some of the other export-oriented sectors. But the whole economic model, this capitalist model, especially the neoliberal model, has been built on export production over local production. So that has to be questioned in the world at large, because it's not a challenge that Sri Lanka can face alone. But I think that given looming food crises and so on, that it is important to prioritize local production and sustainability, and then look at exports, production, so on and so forth.
So unemployment.
Unemployment, yes. Yes, it's really a very sad situation that so many people are leaving the country, especially young professionals. When it's a country with so many resources and so much to offer, and I myself is a product of the free education system. I was also at the university in Sri Lanka for a year. So I know that what a fine education system, healthcare system we've had, which were also very important in terms of keeping population in the country and also providing livelihoods. And along with the demise or the weakening of those sectors, there's also the weakening of production, so that people don't have opportunities. So rather than encouraging people to leave, I think it's important to create job opportunities within the country, even if it is maybe remote work, which has become very popular around the world. Do all these young professionals have to go abroad? Can they, be in the country, but still be connected to global technology and productive activities?
Your book explores the emergence of the crisis in the context of an accelerating geopolitical conflict between China and the United States. In today's context, I think, since the book was published, there have been developments. We spoke at the beginning of our discussion, Donald Trump, trade wars. Has these trends changed in your view, or has Sri Lanka, is Sri Lanka in the face of facing more severe crisis going forward? What are the signs and warnings you have?
Well, it seems that Sri Lanka is facing more severe crises if you look at especially the role of India and Indian intervention. I mean, India was very helpful during the crisis in terms of making loans available and food supply and so on and so forth. But in return, Sri Lanka has had to agree to much that India is wanting in terms of control of the energy security sector and so on and so forth. So that's a very difficult one for Sri Lanka, because India is obviously the big neighbor, and it's very important to have good relations. But how can Sri Lanka's sovereignty, independence, and freedom be upheld in the process of these negotiations?
Right, I think it's time we take a short break here at Hyde Park. We'll return to talk about India, South Asia, and how Sri Lanka's economy will remain resilient throughout the next few years to look at long-term development for the country. We're in conversation with Professor Asoka Bandarage, a scholar and academic specializing in a number of areas and the author of 2 books, including Crisis in Sri Lanka and the World. Welcome back. We're in conversation with Professor Asoka Bandarage, the author of not just 2 books, but 5 books. Crisis in Sri Lanka and the World, Colonialism in Sri Lanka, Sustainability and Well-being, The Separatist Conflict in Sri Lanka. This was published in 2008, if I'm not mistaken. Women, Population and Global Crisis. As I said, you specialize in a number of areas. Now I'd like to talk about conflict analysis. This also links to our conversation earlier about geopolitical crisis, etc. But really in an era where we're talking about increased engagement of countries in these crises that we believed a few decades ago is not a future we will be seeing again in this across the world. But here Sri Lanka, the tiny land, but yet sensitive to these challenges. We're here and we see a lot of extremist crisis, extremist elements also playing a major role in the country. Post-Easter Sunday attacks, do you, in your analysis, see that Sri Lanka has got the strong structures and frameworks, legal framework especially, to counter these emerging global threats from coming into our shores?
Yeah, great question. Identity politics has been weaponized, not only in Sri Lanka but around the world. And divisions are manipulated and created, and this goes back to even the colonial period where I discussed the origins of the so-called ethnic conflict. And that takes attention away from the economic issue of a small elite controlling resources and the livelihoods of the majority, and people are pitted against each other along ethno-religious lines, and now even along gender and sexuality lines. And so that's become a part of the control of populations. And I think that people have to wake up to this reality and recognize the commonality of their issues, the necessity for environmental protection and social protection. So I think that also when there are economic crises and poverty, it's said that 31% of the Sri Lankan population is now below the poverty line. Whereas in 2016, I think the figure was something like 4%. And this again is not just in Sri Lanka. When there is poverty and despair, it's easy to manipulate people. So you can have extremist ethnic and religious organizations manipulating people and taking that attention away from the common economic issues to creating miracles, cures, for example. And this is very common. And that also becomes a way of survival for people, of escapism. Some people commit more crime than others take drugs. Some others are lured by these extremist movements. So it is related to the economic questions. And I think these are things which are very difficult to legislate against. And that's why I think that there has to be awakening, education on the part of people, and particularly those who are in more privileged positions. The majority of people may not be in a position to really question. They are trying to survive. They're trying to get 2 meals per day, send their children to school. But there is still a class of people, not only in Sri Lanka but around the world, who are more privileged, who can question. And I think that their allegiances are very critical in terms of the direction of the world, where they put their energy. Because even in the US, as you know, the society is so polarized now. And that takes attention away from the commonality of the experience and the fact, whether it's the Democrats or the Republicans, it is a handful of billionaires who are really controlling the economy, and who have not only the economic power but the political power and the control of technology, surveillance, so on and so forth. So I think that there has to be a sort of awakening on the part of people to these realities. Otherwise it will become very difficult to curb these kinds of extremism.
But there should be some triggering point, a trigger also from ignorance to awakening. Where do you think we figure that out? You spoke about education, but that's also a vast subject. How do we narrow this down? Where do we begin education? Is this at school level, university level? Because we are also in a discussion whether the school curriculum should be amended to also fit the modern developments. If you can give us some explanation on this.
Yeah, this is really a vast question. I think we've come to the point in human evolution where we have to question what does it mean to be human. Because on the one hand, we have sort of technological advancements in AI and biotechnology, and the attempt to create a transhuman species that is more connected to technology than nature. So I think it's the survival of humanity itself is at stake, not just of other forms of biodiversity. So that is there a future for humanity, and does that call for a fundamental transformation of consciousness and recognition of ourselves as a species in nature and our connectedness to each other and other life forms? And that seems like very abstract and utopian, but we've come to the point of such technological advancements now, of discussion of computer-brain interconnections, that we have to stop and question this extreme technological advancement and talk more about human development. What does human development mean? Is it simply technological advancement and economic growth? Or is there part of our human connectedness to each other as a family, as a species, and our connectedness to other forms of life that we need to preserve? What does that call for? So the questions are at a very fundamental level.
You speak about the philosophy to, how the human evolution, this trend we're talking about, AI to, industrial revolutions, and then where do you think we're going to go? Gen Alpha, let's talk about them.
Yes. They are increasingly connected to technology and have difficulty with relating to each other. And that has created problems in terms of communication, but even the education system is going towards more technology, use of technology. So I think that we have to question technology itself. What kind of technology? It's not against all kinds of technology, but what kind of technology? What is it that human beings need in order to survive? Because there's got to be controls in terms of technological advancement. Technology is also displacing populations because it's said by 2030, 1/3 of the labor force would be AI. So I think that whole model of economic growth and capitalist development needs to be questioned.
But will the cycle return to some sort of normalcy? The normal that we talk about now, not just relying on technology, but to look within, to go back to our roots. Will that be a natural evolution at some point? There is a discussion.
There is a discussion and call for more balanced approaches to living. How much do we need? How much do we need? What is enough? Because the whole system is driven in a way by greed. There's no control on the growth paradigm. So that we are talking about a paradigm that puts planet and people before profit. And there is a global discussion, but we don't really hear that much about it in the mainstream discourse. So we have to really expand the global discussion and its relevance to Sri Lanka.
You are a product of free education in Sri Lanka. You've traveled to the US. You've lectured at some of the top universities in the United States. Again, contributed also to major institutions by way of your contributions in academic and scholarly articles and essays. But at the same time, how do we look back at our education system? I suppose the system remains unchanged regardless of the years, the decades we've passed. The same kind of education you've seen back then continues to be taught to the future as well. So what kind of amendments, changes do you propose?
Yeah, that's it has to change with the times, with the needs. But it's a very competitive education system because the global economy is very competitive. And the change has to come within the education system to move people, children, students towards a more balanced way of living in the world. So the education system has a role to play in imparting this more sustainable way of living. So it is key, but here you find that some of the best teachers are the tuition teachers. Why can't they be teaching within the secondary schools rather than outside in privatized institutions? So there is fundamental changes that are needed, which is not simply preparing the students to pass their fifth exam, I forget what it's called.
The scholarship
exams, yes. Which very young children are under so much pressure to perform, and it's all quantitatively driven. And it is very difficult to change that because that's the nature of the global economic and social system that we are living in. But having a conversation about that is a starting point to really find a more balanced way of living in the world. And the state can actually have a very important role to play there.
We spoke about a few billionaires controlling to the West and then the global South as well as our part of the region. You specialize in South Asia and write a lot. In the face of these geopolitical challenges and the security crisis, especially when we talk about the dynamics of the Indian Ocean region, how do you think South Asia, what is the missing link here? Of course, India, Pakistan, that's an old story now. But where do we begin to link this region in order for all of our countries to benefit not just from the growth of India, but also as a region to have each other's back? Is Sri Lanka possible as a link?
Absolutely. In 1971, there was a declaration to make the Indian Ocean a zone of peace, calling for demilitarization of the Indian Ocean. And Sri Lanka took the leadership in that effort. And that is needed more than ever as the region becomes more militarized and there is surveillance and military exercises by India, China, the United States. So the call for demilitarization of the Indian Ocean would be extremely beneficial to Sri Lanka as well as the region. just as the call for non-alignment, although that is controversial on the, for some people, and also the call for a new international economic order, which includes things like international mechanism for debt restructuring. So those are important things, and Sri Lanka, in spite of its size, has had a record of taking leadership in these efforts in the non-aligned movement in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. Mm-hmm. Sri Lanka hosted the non-aligned conference in 1976, and also in NIEO, the New International Economic Order. So those need to be revived, of course, not in the same shape or form, but to face these new realities in the Indian Ocean and in the world at large.
From being non-aligned, where do you think Sri Lanka should? Do you think Sri Lanka should be aligned to some country, some region, or just continue to maintain this neutrality or non-alignment?
I think that Sri Lanka should be open to relations with all countries, and especially the powerful countries in the world, rather than be aligned with one, whether it's the West or China or India.
On the 8th of March, we will be celebrating once again, every year we do, Women's Day, this year on the theme of all women and girls' rights, equality, empowerment. And this is also about empowering, accelerating action towards empowering women. In Sri Lanka, we still talk about women's representation, not just in parliament, but also overall in the labor force. Female representation is still at 32%, and male representation, while male representation is somewhere above 71%. Again, in parliament, we were talking about 25% quota, but we're getting there, but still there is so much more to be done. But beyond the numbers, how do we really ensure education to empower young girls, to ensure independence for young girls who go on to become adults and change makers in society?
Yeah, great question. I think that instead of accepting the Western model wholesale, countries like Sri Lanka should approach women's empowerment within their cultural contexts. Because in certain situations, even feminism and women's empowerment have been used as tools by external interests. So that there has to be vigilance on that front, but for women to take their rightful place does not mean simply focusing on so-called women's issues, but on these larger issues as well, of economics, foreign policy, cultural destruction, so on and so forth. So there is a lot that women can do in terms of taking their rightful place.
You were a teaching fellow on sociology, women's studies and political science at Yale in the United States, prestigious universities you've taught at, and also you headed the women's studies program. And a number of other universities. I have a list here that our team has shared, but thank you very much, Professor Asoka Bandarage.
Thank you so much, really appreciate it.
Enjoyed having you at Hyde Park and this conversation. Certainly, Professor at California Institute for Integral Studies in San Francisco, and the author of 5 books. I read out the books Professor Bandarage had authored, and also Professor as an academic and an economist specializes in international development, political economy, women, gender studies, conflict resolution, South Asia as a region, and population and ecology. Thank you very much for joining us this week at Hyde Park, and we'll see you at some point when you return to Sri Lanka once again.
Thank you, thank you.
And we'll see you again next week at the same time here at Hyde Park on Other Derana 24. Have a pleasant evening. Good night.